Right, so I'm going to just give a little bit of intro to like why am I here. My name's Matt Sanger. I produce festivals. I've also got at least 20 years experience in running major events. So Bestival, Camp Bestival and Common People in Southampton are the three ones that I was mostly involved in. But I also do produce other smaller shows. I also produce Southampton Mellor, which is a fantastic example of what the city can achieve. And I'd like to introduce my guests. So if I start, should we start on my left? Gary Benetton.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for having me, Matthew and Claire and the team. My name is Gary Benetton, as Matt said. I've been in Southampton for 30 years. I went to the tertiary, not the tertiary college, Southampton Institute before it was named Solent, so that sort of demonstrates how old I am now. I started in the events game when I was about 13 years old, when I basically shoehorned my way into putting on a video club at school. And basically I sold, that was back then on VHS tapes, and I managed to convince my school to let me hire the sports hall for about 10p per admission, if they were allowed, the tuck shop were allowed to sell the Cokes and the Sweeties. That was when I actually learnt my first lesson in event management, when my colleague printed some posters without proofreading them. And he actually put Video Club rather than Video Club. So that was my first sort of lesson, I guess, in promoting. As I said, I went to Solent University, or back then, Southampton Institute, and I started to put on events and selling to the people in my year group. I then became a DJ, blah, 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 blah. And as I progressed, I left university, didn't know what I wanted to do, didn't want to work for anyone, so I decided to buy my own venue, which was the Orange Rooms, which people from Southampton you probably know. And I started that in 2001. We had no money to do it, so it was me and a partner named Danny Foss, and we actually funded it with credit cards, which is probably not a good idea, and I'd never recommend it to anyone, but we did it, and we had a very flexible builder, and it's now 2023, and I'm super proud that it's still there. I've since gone on to stage a lot of events, anything from 1 to probably 80,000 people, I think it's the biggest one I was involved with. The events that only have one person are probably the ones that I don't sell any tickets for, but that's another story. So yeah, had a really interesting journey, put on some great events, had some major catastrophes, one being I had an event in Bournemouth on the beach, sold 5,000 tickets. The night before I went down to check the stage, and the tide had washed the stage into the sand and it collapsed. So I had to refund 5,000 people, which was a very interesting event. But yeah, I'm really grateful to be in the event industry. It offers so much. I get to work with some amazing young people all the time and some creative people. I'm actually 90 years old, but I look 50 because of the fact that I work with young people and creative people. So yeah, that's me.
And now over to Donna.
Hi, everyone. So, yeah, I'm Donna Close. I'm Director of AMP Culture and Director of Festivals and Events International, and pretty much does what it says on the tin. So I do festival and event strategies, cultural strategies, and conceptions and business cases for festivals all over the world. I've spent about 33 years, in different aspects of the festival and event industry, a sector. So I've been an artistic director, a producer, a volunteer. I've spent quite a lot of time with radios that don't work and bin bags. But I've also been a policy maker as well. So I worked within a local authority helping to create the conditions for festivals to thrive as well. So pretty much all those different aspects of it, and different sorts of festivals as well. And I always think that's the really interesting thing about festivals and events, is actually they are inherently very diverse. So I've been involved in lots of different sorts of them, because there are lots of different sorts of them. But I guess my biggest passion has always been around the outdoor arts, free to access, touching on a lot of those themes that we heard about this morning, in terms of the places, the festivals that really bring places to life. I always think about it as being a sort of, conjuring up, the best festivals conjure up the spirit of a place. So it makes it sort of tangible and experiential. You can really understand a place that you go to through its festivals and its events, you know, and by making it tangible, it means that people get to understand it. So people can share things, they can celebrate things, they can critique it, and so it becomes a real agent of change. So that's what I feel really passionate about how festivals can do that. The other thing I was sort of thinking why I've been involved for festivals for so long. I mean, that's a long old sentence, 33 years, isn't it? And one of the things I think is really fascinating about them is how complex they are. You know, they are like incredibly complex beasts. They're like machines that are so complex that you have to give up. You have to have a bit of trust and a bit of a faith. You can't possibly control all the aspects of it. And I think that's what makes them so fascinating, because I really do, because what Alan was saying about how it's about giving up power but not responsibility. I think festivals, that's what they're about, because actually when you talk to people about their experiences at festivals, they're often things that aren't programmed. They're often things that they've created themselves through the encounters that they've had and the experiences they had. And I think that's makes them really special. And then the final thing I really want to say, sort of building really on what Gary just said as well, which is, you know, they're incredibly hard. They're difficult things to do. And I think maybe next time there's a thing like this, we should share our failures. I think it would be an interesting thing to learn, because I think we've all got some spectacular sort of failures to share, and that can be a very empowering thing. You know, it's the best festivals are the ones that are literally feel like a walk in the park, you know, and when you've been involved in them, you realise just how extreme the levels of risk and planning have gone into making it feel like that. So, yeah, that would be my final thought on it.
You're reminding me of the anxieties of my life. I'm.
Please go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah. So I'm Ciro Romano. I'm the founder of Love Supreme Festival in just outside Brighton, and Nocturne Live at Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire, and Kite Festival in Oxfordshire as well. I had a much less colourful background to you, Gary. I was a lawyer for many years. I worked in the city, and then I was head of legal and business affairs at Universal Music. So my first 10 years of my life were kind of quite serious, office-based. And then I guess I had a kind of life-changing moment and decided to go into live music, and that was the first idea for Love Supreme, was in probably 2010, and I was at North Sea Jazz Festival in Rotterdam, and it was such an amazing event, and I couldn't understand why it didn't exist in the UK, that type of event with jazz, R&B and blues and funk. An outdoor event didn't exist. At that point, I'd never promoted anything. I hadn't done anything at university. I'd done nothing, effectively. So I was too old to start promoting at the Dog and Duck in Camden or one of those places. So I kind of had to have a big idea. So I pitched this idea to many sort of strategic partners, Live Nation, etc. So everybody turned it down. And then I went to a few private equity houses, and just as I was it's a classic story, just as I was sort of losing hope, and I was about to throw the towel in, I managed to get the money, and that was in 2011. And Love Supreme has gone from 5,000 in that first year to 25,000 last year. And it's been a kind of slow progression. But as you were just saying earlier, when we talk about failing, I mean, the first 2 or 3 years of that event felt like failing because we were losing so much money. That's been true of every event that I've done. So we've lost money in the first couple of years, and then almost thrown the towel in, and then somehow you hit this kind of tipping point, and it starts to work. And then last year I launched Kite Festival, which is a festival of ideas and music, which is I guess like Hay Festival meets an outdoor music festival, and that's also been very difficult. But the most interesting one actually was the Blenheim Palace one, because Blenheim Palace hadn't been used for about 15, 20 years for concerts. It was kind of seen as a bit of a poison chalice, but we did it, and it was a poison chalice for a couple of years, but then made it work after about 3 years. So a lot of what you were saying rings true to me in terms of the challenges that there are in starting, running, and making those types of festivals successful.
Great stuff. Thank you, Ciro. So I think you're probably the first person I'd like to ask this question to, because you've worked in so many different environments, including internationally as well. What is it that makes an environment where festivals and events can thrive in your experience?
So I think there's sort of three broad elements that you have to nail down, that you have to secure when you're starting like an event that you're trying to create, a brand, you're trying to create something that has some resonance to the people and the wider culture. So I think the first thing is to work out is really presentation. So, what is your aesthetic? What are you trying to convey? And that's in your post, those first images that you're sending out. Everything from the font, the design, the space between the artists, what's included, what's not included. That's so important. It feels like a small thing, but actually that first visual that people see has to resonate with the right people. I'd say that's the first thing. The second thing, which I think is the most important thing, is the content, so the artists that you have. And I think that trying to create a kind of unifying element to the event, so it means something, so people who look at it, it's not a hodgepodge of things, it has some kind of thread running through it. And then the last thing is delivery. Now, delivery might not matter for the first year, but it certainly matters in terms of people coming back every year and creating something that has, as I say, has some kind of resonance and people become attached to, and it becomes part of the fixed calendar. And so it's not just the delivery and event on site, but also the pre-delivery. So the ticketing, how people buy tickets, booking fees, people not feeling ripped off, all those different elements, they're all key in terms of creating, because what you're trying to create is people who come back to your event every year. That's what a successful event is, because the first couple of years, you're always going to be losing money. So, by year 3, you should start to see the light at the end of the tunnel. So I'd say they're the 3 keys for me.
Yeah, and how can a local authority help you achieve that? I'm thinking, we're in a city environment, and what could the local authority do, or what, in your experience, has a local authority done that helps you thrive?
So we've been slightly different in that we've always operated outside public funding in my events. So we've worked with, for better or for worse, private equity houses, strategic partners. But really, for me, working with local authorities, basically it's about licensing, those kind of elements, and it's about an understanding of what you're trying to do and not putting up too many barriers to what you're trying to do. That's the key thing, and we bring so much, so much to that area around Glynde and East Sussex. All the hotels are full, restaurants, etc. So just a kind of understanding of what we are bringing economically through having a successful festival. I think that's the key thing. Not being too rigid, I'd say.
Yeah, excellent point. Donna, what would you like to add anything to that in terms of that creating that environment where festivals and events thrive?
Yeah, of course, and it was great to undertake this process here quite recently in terms of the festival and event strategy as well, because it was really sort of I think trying to guide the city through that process, and I think the first thing that is true about the fact that I was working here is the fact that the City Council, it shows that the City Council is ambitious, that it believes in festival events, that it believes it can make a change in the city, and that's really key. You can't take that for granted. That's a fantastic asset to have in itself as well, and that was pretty much the experience I had throughout all the different stakeholders that I was talking to as well. I've got to say, a great deal of support and understanding. So as a foundation, the fact that people want festivals and events to happen is you can't underestimate that for a start. But I think more interestingly and more importantly, it's about a place having a sense of the story and the stories it wants to tell, like where it is at the moment, how it wants to sort of express that and celebrate that and share that. And I think that's really important. And also like a clear sense of destination as well, sort of the change that wants to be made as well. That needs to not be taken for granted. It needs to be sort of set out and agreed. The other thing that I think is really important about what local authorities can do is recognise that, I think the best festival cities are ones where there's loads of different types of festivals and events happening. You know, it becomes much bigger than the sum of its parts. You know, there's a real sort of economies of scale to be had there. You create pathways for talent to grow and of all sorts, you know, creative production talent, you know, you audiences get shared across those different types of interests, you know, it breaks down barriers, you know, real great believer in that you shouldn't put all your eggs in one basket as a local authority. And then the third thing, which is really important, which is making sure that, you know, councils are massively complicated beasts with regulatory bits and economic development bits and cultural and tourism things. So you need to get everything lined up, you know, get everyone on the same page, you know, so have a real sort of clear sense of festivals and events are important because they do all of these great things for us. So we all have to work together to make them happen.
And Gary, obviously you've been involved in a lot of events in Southampton specifically. What, in your experience, you know, could the city do, and whether that's political or licensing authorities, local authorities, do to help your events thrive?
I think in terms of creating environment, obviously Donna went before me, which is upsetting because she said everything I was going to say. But I think the most important thing is that the city has a clear vision and everyone buys into that, and that needs to start at the top and work its way down, and then communicate it effectively to all the stakeholders. So whether it's parks being told that they have to allow the park to be used on more occasions than one, all the way through. So it's just making sure and getting that collective buy-in, you know, explaining why we want to do festivals, why they're so important, you know, the economic benefits, cultural benefits, you know, the list goes on and on. But having that documented somewhere clearly, like a mission statement on council websites, just so everyone's on board, really, that shared vision. That would be my sort of biggest thing that I think needs to happen. And then, you know, once we've got that, then work on maybe investing in our spaces to allow the events to happen, you know, without causing disruption to local residents. Potentially, you know, creating some sort of infrastructure where new event organisers can get together, and I think you put it in your report, Donna, about, you know, potentially signposting just to nurture new events, you know, because it's very daunting to start an event. I mean, you know, there's a lot of legal jargon, there's lots of paperwork, and I see Craig in the audience, he relishes receiving bundles of documents. But, you know, so I think it'd be really nice if we created some sort of incubator in the city that, you know, it's not just about big events, it's about small grassroots events, community events that may not see the light of day purely because they're shit scared of what they've got to do it, you know. So that would be another thing for me.
Cool. Well, thank you very much. I think it's really interesting. We're at this this very poignant moment. I think the whole city is bought into the City of Culture process, and the idea that culture is going to lead change in the city. Festival and events are obviously a massive part of that. I think what I'd like to know more from you guys is, what other challenges do we face? And I know we've talked about some of them before we got in, so I think maybe raising some of those. So Donna, in your experience, you know, what are the challenges we face that other people need to be aware of?
Well, I think we've had a little bit about it so far because it's always ever present. But when I used to teach at university around arts management, I used to call festivals the extreme sports of the arts. And I think that's true. The risk is huge, and it often falls on a single person or a small arts organisation or a small voluntary group. They're incredibly risky things. And so I think the challenge is about how do you support, like what support do you need to put around those enterprises of all sorts so that the risk is bearable. Because I think what comes with that risk is the burnout, which Carolyn talked about earlier. I think you can really, really see that in the festival and events sector. And as I said in my intro, you know, festivals take an enormous amount of people to make it happen. So if you've got that burnout amplified across all of those different areas that are required, I mean, you can see it with the artists as well as the technicians and the volunteers as well as the promoters. So there is a sort of mental health aspect, I think, like a health and well-being aspect about it. So it's about looking after each other and ourselves. And I think that is probably the fundamental challenge around festivals and events, like what can we all do to support the people who make them happen.
Fantastic. Zero, what's those challenges you faced?
So these are just challenges for just creating an event, generally speaking, as opposed to...
Challenges. So if you're trying to create an environment where you can thrive, the challenges that you face that make that difficult.
Right. Well, I guess if you start from the bottom, you have to raise money, and obviously for some events it's just private. For some it's a mixture of private and public sector money, and that's very challenging because it's a high risk business. And when I say high risk, I really mean it's high risk. Most things don't work, and so putting yourself in a position where you have the comfort of that is really, really important. But also the patience and the partners who have an understanding that something might not be perfect in the first or second year, whether that's the council or your investors or whoever it might be, because you're creating something which you haven't done before. So you're creating something. You're creating this mini city or and things will go wrong. And as long as you accept that, then that makes things easier. So I'd say that's one of the first challenges. The other challenge which we haven't discussed is actually securing talent, which even now, after all these years, and doing all these events and paying all this money, is still incredibly challenging every year. Fees go up. Other festivals are excluding you from the artists that are playing those to play your festival. Agents change, and that's actually, I'd say, as the festival matures, is still the biggest. For me, the biggest challenge to be able to maintain a high level of artistic integrity within the event and without paying huge amounts of money, which then affects whether you can continue is a challenge. Also choosing the right site, which we haven't discussed as well, because if you get that wrong, it's very difficult to come back from that. And we almost chose the wrong site and then got lucky at the end. And just like timing, like there are other, timing is really important. Like sometimes you just get it, the wind is favoring you, and then sometimes it doesn't, no matter what you're doing. I'd say they're the main challenges for me.
Excellent. I want to ask you actually why the music that you chose, why jazz and R&B, funk?
Well, because nobody was doing it. And I couldn't understand. When I came back from North Sea Jazz Festival, the first question was, who else is doing this type of event? And I realized very quickly that nobody was doing it. And then I couldn't quite understand it. So when I was trying to raise the money, I kept on saying, no one's doing this. And the answer was, well, it's for a reason, because it won't work. Nobody likes jazz, and it's not an outdoor event, et cetera, et cetera. But that was the main. I mean, I hadn't harbored a long-held desire to do a jazz festival. It was just like one of those little moments where you think, oh, wonder why. I wonder if this could work in a field in the UK.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point, and I think that's probably to everybody here is if you ever wanted to start something and it doesn't exist, it's like, well, why don't we get on with it? Let's do it. And I think that's links to these challenges that Gary has certainly alluded to about helping people understand the process, and then also from the top down, creating the environment where it's possible. I think, Gary, do you have any additional challenges that you'd like to add?
I think, I'm talking specifically about Southampton in terms of staging events. I think that, we are in a city where politically there's quite a lot of change quite regularly. And I think, and I have to say, both of the, I don't want to get too political, but both of the last Conservative leader and obviously the current Labour leader are really, really cool, and they understand events, which I think is a really positive thing. There's still a few people, I would say, in the system that are probably a bit long in the tooth and don't like change. And I think we've got to, again, it goes back to the joint vision and, the kind of mission statement of the city that, change is good. And I think we just need to catch up with, certain other cities that are leaps and bounds ahead of us in terms of, the appetite to do events. And I think, we need to grow a set. Is what I would like to say. We can't allow a small minority to kind of dictate the direction of travel for the city and events, and it happens a lot, and that is really frustrating. And I think another thing is, we've got two great universities. It would be really nice to give the students of these universities a reason to stay in Southampton. I think we lose a lot of really good talent to Brighton, to London, to Bristol, to Manchester. And it would be really nice to think that the people that we spend all this time training actually want to stay in Southampton because there's enough of a cultural kind of offer to keep them here.
I mean, for me, that's one of the absolute keys for the future success of any of this cultural activity. If young people don't want to stay here, and I don't just mean the people that come into the city to go to university, but also our children, you know, if they don't want to stay here because they don't see a future, because it's not fun enough or whatever it is, then that's a real problem for us economically. So I think, Donna, I'd like to ask you, what could the city do to help facilitate that? So I know you've been involved in the strategy, but how can it make events possible and festivals possible in a way that reacts to what young people want? Because often young people, you know, we talk, there's plenty of genres out there that might not necessarily be viewed that positively, but are still really popular with young people. So what could a city do to help that?
Well, it's sort of making me think about the previous session about leadership, isn't it? I mean, it's sort of, you know, you have to go to them really and make a sort of a space for young people to be putting on the sorts of festivals and events that they want to be and to use that as an opportunity to learn from it. It's a bit like what Gary said at the beginning in his intro about what keeps him young and positive looking is working with younger people, and that's true. So I think there's a lot for us to learn from working with younger people. So I think we need to you know be responsible, create that space, but also create that space genuinely for them to be putting on events that we might want to go to and not be invited to, but want to go to. You know, I think that would be a really, really positive thing. And then there's also roles to play for all the sort of formal parts of the education system as well. You know, and for current festival organisers to be mentors, to be supportive, to offer opportunities to learn by doing, which is always a really important way to learn, very accessible way to learn. Yeah, but of course it's very, I mean, I think the reason I've always loved festivals is they do, you know, they're not like a building which is fixed, they're immutable, they can change, you know, and I hope that, like, you know, if you fast forward in 20 years, it will be, people will still have festivals, have been having them since ancient times, you know, this is a human need, this is about people's human needs. So I'd love to not have an idea what the festivals might look like in 20 years' time, you know, because it's been created by the people of then.
Nice. Great answer. Thank you very much. Ciro, when you're working on your festival, I think particularly that young people, do you give young people the opportunity to learn in that environment and learn to, you know, to fail, to be able to learn from those experiences that they have with you?
You mean our team?
Yeah, in your team, yeah.
Yeah, because it's a job where, you know, you don't. I suppose you can go to university to do it now, but not in our day, right?
Some of my students here.
Yeah, but I guess from when I was growing up, that was not something that you learned. You know, people would go and work in these places, and they would work, you know, from small venues, and then go and work on their own events, outdoor, indoor. But for me, yeah, I give them a lot of rope or flexibility. I don't know what the word is, but yeah, definitely, yeah, to learn and make mistakes. Obviously, with trying to protect us, but
take
yeah,
responsibility.
I try not to be too, I guess. I try not to micromanage, and yeah, I definitely allow them a lot of space to do stuff. And if they get stuff wrong, I tend to know what could go wrong, so therefore there's already damage limitation in terms of if it goes wrong, I know what it's going to be, and it won't be too terrible for the event. Yeah.
What about you, Gary? I know you work with a lot of young people, and you've seen a lot of young people come through. And I know you've talked about that keeping talent here. What do you think the city's not doing now that it could do to help young people stay here and think they had a future, particularly in events and festivals?
Well, I think, again, it links back to what we were talking about at the beginning. We need to create an environment where events happen. And the more events happen, the more likely you're going to want to stay in a city. And then that, of course, you know, the economic benefits of that, it becomes, it almost snowballs into its own kind of ecosystem. But yeah, I mean, I love working with young people. You know, I own a nightclub where there's a lot of youngsters there. You know, give them, I think, as you've just said, you know, you give them quite a lot of rope to. You know, I'd rather people Try things and don't try at all. You know, I think you learn most through failure, and you know we've had a spectacular fair few failures, but you know as long as no one's hurt, I don't think it's there's no harm done. But yeah, I think we just got to start moving forward now. You know, we've get this vision and let's get rolling, I would say.
Cool. One thing that I think really comes out through the whole day is about that leadership. And I think, Ciro, you've just touched on it as well, micromanaging. I think the idea of any future success feels like micromanaging would be a bad approach. I mean, is that something you would agree with for cities that you've worked in and environments you've worked in? Donna, I'll open that to you.
Well, I mean, it's a bit of a dance, I would say, because you have to manage certain things, but you have to also, I think it is the way that I always picture it is by creating this frame. So you're creating a frame in which is a safe space, but in which chaos can happen, you know. So there is a frame, but that people aren't going, and that's the way I try and think about it, I think, because it's, I think if you do micromanage, then I think you're inevitably going to be making it less accessible for a range of people. You're making a lot of those mistakes of dictating what you think people should want, which I think is that's a dangerous area to be in. I think.
I think with micromanaging as well, people end up second guessing themselves a lot. You know, for the younger people, and I think that's not great. You know, I think you've got to give them. I think the parameters that you're talking about are really important. But yeah, I think second guessing yourself and not going on instinct and things that you think might be a good idea, and then it can be bad for creativity as well, I think.
Yeah, just going back to what the guys were saying, I think if I hadn't have allowed young people to lead certain things, I probably wouldn't have an Orange Rooms 23 years later, because it's because of them things have progressed. Because some of the things they've done, if you'd have asked me if it's sensible, I'd have said absolutely not. But I've kind of given them the kind of opportunity to do it, and that's why I'm still here. I'm surrounded by people that know better than me, you know, what the current market is doing.
Cool. And do you think there's examples of cities that do this well that you know of? And I think probably thinking of our cities that are comparable-ish, and I'm certainly not talking about London, therefore, because London's obviously a beast of its own. But are there cities in the country that you think are ahead of us now that we can look at as good examples of where we could get to, realistically? Gary, you've got your microphone.
Well, Donna, Donna, you live in Brighton still, don't you? I think so. I used to work quite heavily in Brighton. I launched a club called Audio when it used to be the Escape Club. I rebranded it as Audio, and I spent quite a bit of time in Brighton. I would suggest they're probably back then of where we are now currently. So I would suggest Brighton is a great example. Similar size, I would say, I think, but a lot more open.
Yeah. It's interesting, actually, on that point. When we started Love Supreme, we utilised our design company was local in Brighton. We used a Brighton company. We used Brighton for our website. We did deals with all the local DJs and nightclubs. We gave them their own bit in the site at the festival, so they ran the DJ stuff. We did the local jazz club. We gave them their own stage. I mean, basically, nearly everybody who was involved in it was from Brighton, you know, and I think that made a big difference in terms of creating a goodwill towards us. You know, we weren't just coming down from London and, you know, utilising everybody from London. We didn't hardly anybody that we used who worked on the festival wasn't from Brighton.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it's. This is the curse. I'm looking at Woodrow here as well. I don't know if Brighton's as good as it used to be, but isn't that what everyone in Brighton says? But it used to be better back in the day. But I do think it's had a lot of challenges, and I think some of the challenges have come from the same things that Gary was talking about earlier in terms of like changing political leadership. It flip-flaps every election, and that means that there's not been long-term investment and it's expensive to be there, so a lot of talent moves out because it's very, very difficult. I mean, it's still a brilliant creative city, but I think it has got its challenges. I think there's another place that I think is quite interesting in terms of festivals is Bristol, and I think the thing that's interesting about Bristol is the way that the sector itself, sort of in the absence of a council taking a leadership role, the council was very much into putting on its own festivals and events. And it was almost like the sector reacted by organising itself, creating a network that became a limited company, that took over a building, that then started to share assets. And we know that festivals can be quite competitive. They can be quite competitive, inevitably. So having this collaborative forum led by the sector has been a very powerful thing, I think, for that city. So I'd hold that as a good example. And then Rotterdam, which Zero talked about earlier on, I think that's such a brilliant festival city. And I think in terms of policy terms, the approach they've taken, the Rotterdam festivals and all of that sort of stuff is absolutely fantastic. And it shows that you can create, in a top-down way, you can create the conditions in which festivals and events of all sorts can thrive, by getting out of the way on the creative bits. But, getting out of the way, I think sometimes is the most important thing.
Right, and I think we all have been involved in festivals. We were talking about it earlier, that it really takes 3 years before you start breaking even, where you start having customers come through the door in a way that allows you to then move to the next step. And I think that support from the local environment, working with local partners, is absolutely critical. So leaning into that a bit, what do you think the assets that Southampton has that we can leverage to make a successful festival and event city? So I'll start with Gary. That's okay, Gary?
I think, Southampton has ambition. That's clear. We're doing this type of event. We've went through the City of Culture 2025 bidding process. We've now got the new Southampton Cultural Trust. There's clearly ambition there. And we've also got bags of creativity, experience, energy, enthusiasm for events. So I think that's a real positive. We've got some excellent spaces. Mayflower Park, the Common, Palmerston Park, and obviously a host of other kind of green spaces and sites in some of the outlying communities, Millbrook, Bitton Park, etc., etc. I would say we've got an excellent events team. I know Craig's in the audience; he'll be happy with that. But we generally do have an excellent events team. We have a very supportive licensing authority. I think they're great, and we have a very supported local authority. I just think they need, again, this clear vision to look up to then be able to make some decisions that, again, sort of for the wider good rather than a select few. That would be my thing. And of course, we just won Purple Flag as well, which is another great bit of news. Great asset for the city. It goes to show that we're organised and we can demonstrate best practice in the sort of early evening and nighttime economy. So that's a real bonus.
And then Cyril or Donna, either one of you. Cyril, do you want to go? Yeah.
Well, I was quite surprised. Well, I hadn't really thought about it, but why Southampton doesn't have a bigger festival, like a bigger music festival, like for the size of the city. I thought that was quite odd. So for somebody like me, that's a positive thing because it means that there's an opportunity there to do something. So I don't know why that is. I mean, Gary will know better than me, but it seems strange that a city of this size doesn't have something which is on a larger scale music event. So that doesn't really answer your question, but I'd say that's an opportunity in and of itself.
That's good, because you've just answered a key question about the market size. Perfect. Yeah. And Donna, what about you from your experience so far?
Well, I'm upset, Gary, that you didn't say the strategy, because now I'm going to have to say it. So, there's a festival and event strategy that has been co-created through the input of a lot of stakeholders that does set out some of those things in terms of where Southampton could be, what some of the challenges are and the barriers are and how they might be amounted. I was going to say the same as well in terms of having a supportive council with a very experienced and knowledgeable events team that are really well networked and can fight some of the battles on behalf of the festivals and events is not to be underrated at all as an asset. The sector is very you know, it's diverse and brilliant and experienced and up for it. Chomping at the bit was my sense, you know, wanting to be able to do more and just needing the support to do so. You know, the city is really attractive to commercial festival organisers. So I think that's really interesting. You know, it definitely is. There's a lot of demand from it, and it's just, you know, that says a lot about the potential market, says a lot about the potential spaces, that just needs to be unlocked a little bit more. And then finally, I just wanted to say something about I came out earlier, but like I think the idea about the history and like distilling the spirit of the place, and you know, the maritime thing and like what that means now. You know, what does that mean in terms of being looking to the world, to be outward looking, you know, to be diverse and about trade and about adventure and courage. You know, there's a modern interpretation of that maritime history that I think is a real thing to embrace rather than just being about ships, you know.
Sorry, you look like you were ready to add something there.
I'm just thinking that I can already see the marketing for that already.
Perfect. So we got a couple more moments before we ask some questions from the audience. I'd like to have a bit of fun with you guys. Tell me about your absolute funniest and worst disaster in terms of related to a festival. So if we start off with Ciro, I'm sure you've had a few. Well, just pick one, just to make everybody realise that it's not all fun and games.
The worst and the best.
Yeah, that's fine. Worst and best. Need your microphone.
I mean, the worst is always the weather, always. So, I mean, there's lots of, you know, there's been artists pulling out, big artists pulling out at the last moment, not being able to replace them. You know, one of the worst things is when your Instagram or your Facebook, somebody gives a complaint and then it just starts. So nothing really happens, and all of a sudden it goes from 1 to 50 to 500, and it just, you know, for whatever it is, the lose or didn't weren't working. But for me, the weather, I remember the build in 2017, and just being, you know, I felt I had to get in with the production guys, you know, so I got in there, and the sludge and the mud and things falling apart and things falling and not being able to get the site ready on time. It was actually sunny on the Friday, but because we're building on the Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, they're usually the worst ones. And the best ones are when you have an event and that you have that moment where you think, I think this might work. That's the best moment. You know, like it might be a little moment with one act and everyone singing along or clapping, and then you just have that one moment where you think, well, I think we're in business here. Yeah.
Great. And what about you, Gary?
Well, I mentioned the stage collapse before a show in Bournemouth Beach, and it was crazy because the Kaiser Chiefs were actually playing as it collapsed, so they had to do a show stop, which was interesting. It was like the tide had never been like record-breaking high tides. It happened to, of course, happen the weekend on.
There's an irony there with high tide.
Yes, yeah, there is. Yeah, I think what else has happened? Quite a funny story. I had to go to a London hotel with $50,000 in a Tesco bag and give it to Snoop Dogg in a hotel. And it was one of the craziest. He didn't count the money. He was just obviously so stoned. It was with his team. It was like a little weedy English guy and Snoop, which I found really strange. And yeah, so that was bizarre. And then of course he did the show in the evening, and obviously he likes to smoke weed whilst he's performing. So of course it was a nightmare. And there's a smoking ban obviously clearly in venues, and you know, there was lots of people taking pictures. I'm thinking, oh God, I'm going to be absolutely screwed. So I kept having to tell people it's an electronic cigarette. We're going to allow them to smoke it, but it was obviously a joint. So yeah, which was really. But you just couldn't. I couldn't dare take it off him because in case he had a hissy fit and walked out. It's just a nightmare. And I suppose one of the funnest, another sort of kind of a rock and roll story, I guess. I worked with a friend who was doing security and I'm certainly not security, but he was working with Oasis, and I ended up at a hotel room with just me, Liam Gallagher, and his sort of close protection. Liam Gallagher playing the guitar and me trying to sing all the Oasis bits that Noel Gallagher would sing, which was very interesting. But yeah, that's it.
Nice, great rock and roll moments there for you.
I can't really beat that, but mine's a bit more silly. So I set up a festival called White Night Brighton, which is the most ridiculous idea for a festival because it was an all-night arts festival that ran from 6 in the evening till 6 in the morning. It was of all new work for one night only. That was the idea of it, and it grew to about 80 different events. It was quite insane. And then it was on the last Saturday in October when the clocks go back, because the idea was you had this extra hour that you could play with and you could do whatever you wanted to do in that hour. That was a sort of conceit of it. But it also fell on the same time as the zombie walk. So one of my favourite memories is of the zombies holding the Sea Life Centre to siege at about 2 o'clock in the morning, and them all trying to get through the gates, and the Sea Life manager being very furious with me and calling me all sorts of names.
Excellent stuff. Right, so we're going to open it up to some questions from the crowd. So I'm going to wait for a wonderful assistant to come over with the 2 questions that have been asked. Okay, so I'm going to ask this one first. Are there investments the city and venues could make that would be better suited to hosting festivals? Or make a site venue better to suit hosting festivals? Sorry, so are there investments that make a site venue better suited to hosting festivals? And I think I've added the city bit in there because there are things that I think cities can do as well that we've probably discussed as well before.
Yeah, I think I touched on this earlier. I think if we invest in spaces, that would be a positive thing. I think just from a practical point of view, having had quite a difficult fireworks display, and again, Craig is probably having a panic attack as we talk about it. You know, stuff like, can we put some power in? Can we put some water in? Can we put some basic infrastructure in to help facilitate events? It might be some more pathway around or between, a green field potentially to get trucks on and off without messing up the ground. So I think there's lots of little practical things that we could do to invest in sites to make them more user friendly, and also, making it sort of maybe more pleasant for the rest of the people that might use a green space after, rather than us churning up the park. If there's a bit more sort of physical infrastructure in place, we're less likely to make damage.
I think that also speaks to the question earlier about accessibility. And having pathways in so people don't have to cross over fields to get to spaces would be beneficial for people with disabilities. Yeah,
I just want to add to that because I think that's such a good point. And one of the really interesting spaces that came out through the strategy was the Mayflower Park, and the challenges that has around it not being 100% fit for purpose, but also the really archaic laws that govern some of these outdoor spaces, that you can only use it 14 times a year, and it's got to be for sheeps, But it's about how you get involved, start lobbying, organise. Often councils only ever hear the voices that are complaining. They don't often hear the people that are advocating. So I think just to get involved in some of those things and try and change some of those restrictions that are in place is quite an important thing.
Both of what they were saying, but there's one interesting thing in Glasgow, in Kelvin Grove Park, and also at Love Supreme in Japan. There's permanent venues in the park. So in Glasgow, there's a stage, and it's there all year round. I don't know when they built it. I guess you call that hard standing. And in Japan, where we do Love Supreme, it's the same thing. In that park, there was a stage, not an old stage, like newly built, with seating capacity. I think it was about 1,000 people, and various other hard standing elements, which made it really easy and cut the costs for our partners to put the festival on. So I think that's an interesting thing that we don't really do we, here?
No, it definitely feels that those infrastructure needs, they could be taken care of, and it wouldn't just be for me. So putting an electric points in would benefit us as music promoters or festival organisers, but it would also benefit the boat show. It would benefit lots of different types of events. So definitely one I think that could be considered and taken forward. I think that answers one of the other questions with how do we create a festival that survives. So I'd actually like to, there's one question on here that's more linked to the music infrastructure that I would like to ask. That is essentially, how can we get our independent venues recognition they deserve? And I think using events and festivals maybe as a medium. So I'm going to put that to Donna.
Oh, I was going to actually answer that sort of first part of the question, really, which is I think one of the things that I love most about festivals is that they can have their lifespan, and they're not there as a big white elephant. So sometimes some of them are only born to last 10 years, and that's okay. And I think there's, that creates space. Like if we imagine it all as an ecosystem, as a garden, some of them dying allows others to grow. So I think it's very, very important to not hold on to them when they've served their time. Just think it's an important point to make.
Oh, absolutely, I agree completely. So I think just going back to that, the question. So the Creative Festival survives. We know there's economics around it. I think we've answered quite a lot of the elements of it. But Southampton definitely has that rich heritage with music. How can we as events and festival producers help them get the recognition they deserve, do you think? Gary, as an independent music promoter.
I think obviously the city can do more to advertise these types of venues. I think it can support them more. I think, having, cities with individual independent venues are kind of what makes it really. So Southampton has got the Joiners, Orange Rooms, I'll have to say, lots of independent venues that you cannot find anywhere else in the country, and I think they should be celebrated. But there's lots we can do. We can support maybe with business rates. That would be a lovely start. If the council could somehow lower business rates for small independent venues, but that's obviously a higher political decision to be made. But make it giving them an environment in which they can succeed, and a lot of it will again come from the top, I would suggest.
But it's a nationwide issue with smaller venues. It's not an issue which is particular to Southampton. It's everywhere, and especially post-COVID, it's actually the smaller shows to medium-sized shows that have been suffering. So it's not the bigger shows. So people are still going to see Coldplay at Wembley Stadium, still going to the O2 or Brighton Arena. They're still going to those venues. But there's a structural, I think, issue with smaller venues and small to medium-sized venues. I don't know what the answer is to that, apart from government support. But it's not particular to Southampton, I don't think.
No, absolutely. But I think it's the idea and how it links to festivals and events for me is they're absolutely key to the lifeblood and success of our larger events. And I think it's certainly an important part of that ecosystem that we need to protect in our work.
But, the bigger problem as well is that music, because since the progression of technology, music's been made so differently. So there's less bands, there's less acts that break through those venues, because everyone's, if you look at the percentage of bands versus solo artists, I think it was 60-70% bands 20-25 years ago. Now it's like 10%, because everyone's making music at home. Nobody wants to be in a band. Everyone wants to be a solo artist. Everyone who's getting signed. It's very difficult. So those venues don't really work for those kind of acts. So there's a bigger structural problem as well, which is why they're suffering.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we could probably talk about all of these subjects for forever, and I'm sure, hopefully, everybody has found this a really enlightening discussion, just as I have. And I'd like to ask everybody to thank our guests, Gary, Donna, and Ciro, for their wise words. Cool. Thank you very much.